So we'd like to welcome Steve Wondzell. He's a research ecologist for the USDA Forest Service at the Pacific Northwest Research Station. His work is broadly focused on advancing the fundamental understanding of the interactions between physical and biological processes in ecosystems and how these processes influence ecosystem behavior. His work is both basic and applied, with a strong focus on streams and their riparian zones, examining the effects of land management, climate change, other disturbance processes, and ecological restoration. And he recently published a paper earlier this year that was called Hot Air or Dry Dirt, investigating the greater drought risk to forests in the Pacific Northwest. And we invited Steve to present about this new work. So welcome, Steve.
So the first thing, I do want to talk about this topic that we've been working on for the last several years, especially exploring the potential role of atmospheric drought as opposed to hydrologic drought or drought that's mediated through soil moisture availability. It's really important, though, to say that what I'm talking about here is actually primarily the work of Carla Jaretsky. She was a PhD student who finished up a couple years ago. Myself and Kevin Bladen were her co-major professors. Also, as co-authors on the paper that she published, be talking about today was Rick Meinzer, who is a plant physiologist working for the Pacific Northwest Research Station, and a fellow graduate student now finished her PhD, Linnea Hawkins. So, but Carla was really the person who did all the work that I'll be talking about today. So thought I'd just kind of start by relaying the key findings from her work, and then to try really to emphasize a major caveat. So the key findings that come out of this is that atmospheric drought in the future is likely to be the biggest source of water stress for our West Side Oregon Doug-fir forests, and that the role of changing precipitation in the future is likely to have a much, much smaller effect than increasing temperatures. And then there's an interesting speculation that comes out of this, and that's that thinning could possibly actually increase the drought stress which trees are experiencing. So I want to really emphasize that this is a speculative idea. Maybe think of it as a hypothesis, something that needs further testing to really understand if thinning will in fact have a counterintuitive influence on forest productivity. But we'll get into why that might happen and give you a better idea of where these results come from. So start then kind of with our dominant paradigm for forest management, and that basically is that trees are competing, amongst other things, they compete for soil water. And so if we have a forest that's somehow water limited or water stressed, the idea is that if you thin that forest, you'll make more soil water available and then potentially reduce tree mortality during drought periods. And this was effectively the premise that was put forward in this paper, Watering the Forest for the Trees. So that's kind of our dominant paradigm, but in recent years, this idea of atmospheric drought has been moving to the front. So these are data graphs that I took from this paper that was published in Nature Climate Change in 2016. The lead author is Kimberly Novak. And they made comparisons at a variety of sites across North America where they had data on tree growth or tree behavior under different kinds of soil moisture and air dryness conditions. So this graph shows trees, a ponderosa pine tree growing outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, and it shows a pattern you would expect for when soil moisture is a major control on tree growth. So across the bottom on the x-axis, we have vapor pressure deficit, and that's a measure of the dryness of the atmosphere. The bigger the number, the drier the atmosphere. On the y-axis, we have conductance, surface conductance of the leaf or the needle in this case. And the bigger the number, the more open the stomates are on the needle, and it's easier for the tree to have carbon dioxide from the atmosphere move into the needle. So more stomates are more open when conductance is high, and more gas can move in and out of the stomates. So the circles are color coded by soil moisture, with the driest soil conditions being the lightest brown and the wettest in the dark black. Okay, and so what you see here is that this tree is responding to both dryness of atmosphere and soil moisture. When the soils are really, really wet, the vapor pressure deficit does have an influence on the tree, but when the soils are really, really dry, that relationship between soil moisture and atmospheric dryness really changes. So the drier the soils, the more responsive the tree is to this vapor pressure deficit. So we can contrast this tree that follows our normal paradigm, where soil moisture has a big influence on tree growth, with a tree that's growing just outside of Corvallis, Oregon, a Douglas fir tree. This is in the Coast Range. And here you see these lines completely overlap. Right? The driest soil to the wettest soil, these lines overlap. And the response of the tree is entirely controlled by the vapor pressure deficit. And that response is identical whether the soils are wet or dry. So this is a tree that's basically not at all sensitive to how much water is in the soil, but rather sensitive to how dry the atmosphere is. So this response is completely different than what you expect for the ponderosa pine. And this data here for the Douglas fir follows this kind of counterintuitive idea, right? That the dryness of the atmosphere is really the major factor that's going to be controlling water stress and carbon fixation in the trees. And in this paper, they even went on so far to say that management activities such as thinning or irrigation, etc., that try and ameliorate tree water stress may become less and less effective in the future as tree growth becomes more and more controlled by atmospheric water stress. So this then is the background for Carla's research project. She did her work at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, which is in the west side of the Central Cascades in Oregon. She ended up, she had 9 plots that were on the north-facing slope of a watershed at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And she had 3 trees at each of these plots, and she collected cores from each of those trees. The site was logged in the early 1960s through the middle of the 1960s. There was trouble with reestablishing trees on the site, but the trees effectively were established by the early 1970s. It's monoculture Douglas fir forest. It's never been thinned, so even though the trees are 50 years old, they remained fairly spindly, small diameter trees. And it's on a very, very steep slope, slopes around 35 degrees. The soils are relatively deep and very, very stony, as shown in these photographs here. And the question that she focused on really could be kind of boiled down to this: are trees thirsty or are they hungry? And that contrast is really important because we think about when trees are water stressed, right, that somehow the soil is too dry for them to grow effectively and they have to shut down. But on the other hand, you think, well, if the atmosphere is just dry, they have plenty of water in their rooting zone, well, they're just going to shut their stomates and wait. But the problem with that, when trees close their stomates, their photosynthesis is really limited. So their ability to set aside carbohydrate reserves over the course of the growing season is limited. And in fact, trees can suffer substantial stress if they're not able to photosynthesize across the summer. So that was kind of Carla's idea of what the question is going to try and answer. So we looked around for some metrics to try and identify this, and she picked two. One is late wood growth, and the other is the concentration of the 13C carbon isotope in the late wood, and asked how those metrics would respond to interannual variability in vapor pressure deficit, the dryness of the atmosphere, and rainfall, which we treated as a proxy for soil moisture. And we also asked when, over the course of the year, are changes in rainfall and vapor pressure deficit most important? So the first thing I want to do then is kind of describe these two metrics, late wood growth and the delta 13 carbon concentration, and how they're related to tree water stress. So starting with late wood growth, you see in this little inset photograph a typical core from one of Carla's trees with a greatly enlarged photograph of the tree rings down below. And you can see that the tree rings over the course of 1 year start out really white, and then they become dark brown. And then there's an abrupt boundary, and then the next growing season starts with this light white to dark brown. Well, these are called respectively the early wood, which is the white wood, and the late wood, which is the dark wood. And what happens is that at the beginning of the growing season, both the atmosphere is relatively moist and soils are really wet. So trees are growing under non-water stress conditions. And as each new cell is generated, it begins to grow in size or inflate. And as long as a tree isn't under substantial water stress, the cells will inflate to their full size, their full diameter, and then the next cells will inflate to their full size. As the system gets drier and drier, the tree becomes under more and more water tension. So it's kind of, if you will, like a pressure from lack of water or from water stress that's keeping the cells from enlarging. So that's what you see in these brown cells. The cells don't inflate to their full size. And because water stress prevents them from enlarging in size, what happens is that the cellulose gets laid down and the cell wall layers get thicker and thicker and thicker. And the thicker cell walls show up as much darker brown wood. So that's the late wood. And the late wood is growing during that period of year when the tree is more likely to be experiencing water stress, so that the size of the late wood ring will potentially be related to the amount of water stress that the tree is experiencing when that wood is being laid down. Okay, so that's the idea of the diameter of, or the width of that ring then is calculated as a basal area increment, and you'll see that abbreviated as BAI in the talk. So the carbon 13, delta carbon 13 metric is a bit different. So here's, first of all, just a quick reminder of what happens in photosynthesis. The tree uses sunlight and takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and water that's provided through the roots. And it makes various carbohydrate compounds. What's shown here basically is a simple CH2O, which is just a chemical abbreviation for some sort of generic carbohydrate, and it also releases oxygen back to the atmosphere. Well, turns out that carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has two common stable isotopes of carbon. These simply differ by the presence of one neutron in the nucleus of the carbon atom, and most of the carbon, 99% of it, is carbon-12, but there's a tiny 1% of the atmosphere that actually has carbon with this extra proton in its nucleus. Well, both kinds of CO2, 13C CO2 and 12C CO2, go in and out of the stomates into the needle. But the process of photosynthesis, of transferring the carbon across the cells and into the interior of the leaf, preferentially selects for the carbon-12 molecules. And that's simply because it's lighter and it's more easily transported across these membranes. So the C13 gets left behind, it returns to the atmosphere, and the tree will preferentially fix carbon-12 into the carbohydrates in photosynthesis. But when the tree gets water stressed, the stomates close. The tree will use up all the carbon-12 that's available inside this, and then it's left with the carbon-13. And because you can't replace the carbon-13 with carbon-12 from the atmosphere as readily, the tree will start using more carbon-13 than if the tree wasn't water stressed. So it seems, this is just really basic chemistry of photosynthesis, but it turns out that we can really easily measure the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in wood on a mass spectrometer, and thus the ratio is really sensitive to water stress. So we'll see that abbreviated with this funny Greek letter and 13C. So this is just delta 13C, and that number increases with increased water stress. I apologize, but the way the formula was worked out historically, delta 13C values are always negative. So if you will, the less negative value, so this is, I show the delta 13C in tree rings over time in this bottom graph. The less negative value is the more water stress condition. So what do I have here? I have the vapor pressure deficit averaged over the growing season for both the daytime in the dark orange and the nighttime in the light orange over a series of years starting in 1990. The little pictures of everybody keep blocking parts of my screen that I want to read, and then I have to keep moving that around, sorry. But going from 1990 to 2019, actually. The middle blue shows total annual rainfall for those years, and then there's basal area increment for the 9 trees that Carla analyzed, plus the average condition, which is in the dark black, and then the delta 13C carbon-13 measurements, which only go from 1999 through 2019 with the 9 trees. And so you can begin to see there's a bit of a relationship, like in this year here, which is, I believe, 2003. It was very dry. There was little rainfall. Vapor pressure deficit was relatively high. And you can see that the basal area increment, the width of the late wood rings were narrow compared to other years, and that the carbon-13 value was increased to indicate water stress. The data look a bit noisy and it's hard to see a clear relationship here. And we also faced another problem. We wanted to relate these measures of vapor pressure, of basal area increment and delta carbon-13C to these environmental measurements of vapor pressure deficit and rainfall. But when over the course of the growing season or even the previous year, would vapor pressure deficit or rainfall perhaps influence tree growth, right? We have these time series data. This work is done at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. The research there is focused on long-term things, and so we have long-term climatic records, but we really don't know when the tree might be sensitive. For example, this is the current year period. This is on the right, going back in time 18 months to the previous year growing season. So for example, the size of the late wood ring or the delta carbon-13 concentrations might just be sensitive to the vapor pressure deficit or rainfall from mid-June to mid-July of the current growing season. That's one possibility, right? But maybe actually those things are sensitive to the late spring vapor pressure deficits or daily rainfall, or maybe they're sensitive to the entire growing period, Or maybe there's some kind of a lag effect and the trees is actually responding to something that happened in the previous growing year or growing season. Or maybe the tree somehow is combining all of this environmental information over the previous 18 months, and that's what's controlling the late wood growth and the delta carbon 13 concentrations. So that we face this problem. We really don't know when during the course of the growing season or the previous year or the previous growing season, the tree is sensitive to its environment. So what we did is use the program that's available in R, and it does a window analysis, and it looked at every possible window over this 18-month time period and looked for the best possible correlation between our environmental variables and our tree growth metrics. So we tried every single day. We tried the 1st of September, the 31st of August, the 30th of August, every 2-day period. So we'd combine the 1st of September with the 31st of August, the 31st of August, and the 30th, a 3-day, 4-day, 5-day, 365-day, all the way up to a full 18-month period. So this is thousands and thousands and thousands of linear regressions and look for a correlation between our metrics. And then Carla basically selected those time periods that were most closely related to the tree growth metrics. And so that's what's shown here. On the left-hand side shows the basal area increments and the time period over which we looked for a relationship in both a vapor pressure deficit and rainfall. And on the right-hand side, we have the opposite. We have, or not the opposite, we have the delta 13C measurements. And so what you see for the basal area increment was that we have a very, very strong correlation between the size of the late wood rings and vapor pressure deficits from mid-June to mid-July. And that's about equal for daytime versus nighttime vapor pressure deficits. So the tree is highly sensitive. The width of the rings are highly sensitive to how dry the atmosphere is just over this relatively short time period. The delta 13C signature is a bit different. You can see it's highly related to vapor pressure deficit again, with a really good R-square, 0.8, and that as the vapor pressure deficit gets higher, so the atmosphere gets drier and drier, the delta 13C measure increases. But that occurs over the period from approximately May through September, so the entire summer growing season. And the delta 13C signature was also sensitive to precipitation. The precipitation window was a little bit narrower. It was from May through August. Now, if I think back about how I described how the tree lays down early wood and late wood, this period here from June to the July is when the late wood cells are actually produced. And over the course of the rest of the growing season, as the tree continues to produce carbohydrates, those carbohydrates are laid down in the cell walls of that late wood, so that it would make sense that the delta carbon 13C measure is sensitive to the entire growing season when the cell walls are thickening over that time period, and the diameter, the ring width would be sensitive to how dry things are in early summer when the cells are actually initially being produced and growing. So what we see here then is really strong evidence for water stress in our metrics, but what we see on the right-hand side of the graph with delta carbon 13C is that the tree is sensitive both rainfall and vapor pressure deficit. Well, this is a problem for us to try and empirically separate the relative importance of dry atmosphere versus dry soils, because these things are highly correlated. If we have a wet summer with lots of rainfall, then we have lots and lots of days with a wet atmosphere. If we have a dry summer with little rainfall, we tend to have lots and lots of days when the air is dry and it's hot and sunny. So we see a strong correlation between rainfall and vapor pressure deficit, which makes it difficult to tease out the relative importance of the dry atmosphere to the rainfall. So Carla tried to attack this problem using a model. The model she chose was the soil plant atmosphere model, or the SPA model. It's a model that basically simulates carbon fixation through photosynthesis and the influence of water stress on the tree. She parameterized the model for a typical 50-year-old Douglas fir growing on the west side of the Oregon Cascades. And then she ran the model with daily measurements of our climate and soil moisture data coming from the Andrews weather stations. And in the model, she examined a bunch of different scenarios for both changes in precipitation and changes in vapor pressure deficit, and those are illustrated here. I forget what year this was. I think it might have been 2019. She just picked a year. Like I said, I think it's 2019, and this is the rainfall that occurred that year. And then she made her simulations increasingly dry. So the darkest black color here was the actual rainfall, 100% of the rainfall that fell that year. And then she made, in 10% increments, she reduced the rainfall. So for every day that we measured rainfall, she just reduced that by 10% to 90, so 90%, 80%, et cetera, until you get up to these reds where the year was very dry with only 10% of the rainfall. That was simulated to model. On the other side of the graph, she increased maximum daily vapor pressure deficit, and she did this. She kept the actual water vapor in the air constant, and she increased temperatures. And as temperature goes up, the vapor pressure deficit goes up. So the dark color at the very bottom was the actual vapor pressure deficits for any given day of the year that she selected. And then she simply increased the temperature to increase the vapor pressure deficit. And those are her model simulations. And of course, she did simulations where she included both changes in VPD and changes in rainfall. So these are her results just being separated out here. And so what you see is, first of all, she did actually run simulations where she decreased rainfall throughout the winter rainy season, and those basically had no influence on tree growth. So she's only reporting simulations where she started changing rainfall on the 1st of April. And what you see is on the y-axis, she has tree growth, gross primary productivity, and this is the difference in gross primary productivity measured in grams of carbon per meter square. And it's cumulative over the course of the growing season as the growing season progresses. And so what you see is that drier conditions with less rainfall, you have, in this case, 50 fewer grams of carbon captured by the tree over the course of, well, by July, okay? And so the wetter and wetter it is, you have less and less effect. And then the black line is just the basic what happened that year with no decrease in rainfall. And then you see the same pattern for changes in vapor pressure deficit on the other side. Again, the drier the atmosphere, the less you have, the bigger influence you have on the tree's gross primary productivity, and the wetter the atmosphere, have smaller and smaller effect. Okay. Well, question is, like, are these simulations realistic? I mean, I'm not used to thinking about tree growth as grams of carbon per meter square per year. That metric is kind of meaningless. And similarly, like, what about these total rainfalls or increases in maximum VPD? Let's see, can I put this? So future estimates of climate change coming from climate change models suggest that air temperatures should increase by about 1.2 to 5 degrees C, and that would translate to increases in vapor pressure deficit of 0.25 to about 1 kilopascal drier atmosphere. And those same models predict that future rainfall might be only 66% of current rainfall. So if we look at the model results for these estimates of future climate, what you see is that the changes in rainfall, 66% of the current rainfall, would decrease gross primary productivity of the tree by about 1%, and contrast that to a typical 1 kilopascal drier atmosphere, which is a 5-degree increase in air temperature, and that would lead to about a 6% decrease in tree growth, gross primary productivity. So those numbers to me seem kind of small, 1%, 6%. So, is that something we should be concerned about? And there's different ways to think about this, but I'm guessing that many of you, maybe all of you, are thinking about retirement portfolios, and the difference of getting 1% versus 6% on a retirement portfolio over time is pretty enormous. If you're in the business of growing trees, this gross primary productivity is the wood that you sell at the end of 40 or 50 years or 80 years or whatever the rotation age of the stand is. And if you get 1% or 6% less growth each and every year, when you add that up over the total period of the stand rotation, that's a substantial change. And what you see is that air temperature and vapor pressure deficit are likely to have a much, much bigger effect in the future than will rainfall. Okay, so this goes back then to key findings. I think Carla's data provide not perfect, but at least strong evidence for the importance of atmospheric drought, and that precipitation changes in the future are likely to have a much smaller effect on forest growth than increasing air temperatures and the role of atmospheric drought. So why then do we speculate that thinning could make things worse? So if you think about a typical west side forest, maybe especially one that's regrowth, second growth, commercial forest, we tend to have dense canopies that are closed, so closed dense canopies, and hot, dry air in the atmosphere above the tree canopy doesn't readily mix deep into the canopy of the forest, so that only the needles at the very top of the tree are being exposed to these driest atmospheric conditions. Then if you take that stand and thin it, which is being done a lot in part for fuels management, for example, and you thin that stand and open up the canopy, then both air and sunlight can penetrate much deeper into the canopy of a given stand. And when it's really hot and dry, that means that really dry air can penetrate much more deeply through the canopy of a stand and potentially increase the actual amount of water stress that that stand is experiencing, regardless of how much water is actually in the soil. So this is really a new paradigm. That idea has not been critically tested in the Western Oregon Cascades or elsewhere in Oregon, to my knowledge. And it is something, however, I think we should look at, this idea that we think we get these mutual benefits by thinning of reducing the fuel load and at the same time making the stand more resilient to drought that we expect to come in the future. But possibly that stand could actually be more susceptible to drought, not less, through thinning alone. Remember, I started with this slide comparing ponderosa pine and flagstaff versus Douglas fir growing outside of Corvallis, Oregon. And it's very clear that different kinds of forests growing in different kinds of climates would have different relationships. So if we see this relationship for Douglas fir on the west side of the Cascades, there's no reason to think we're also going to see that for mixed conifer or ponderosa pine stands growing out in the Blue Mountains, for example, or on the east side of the Cascades. However, there is some general support for this idea that the dryness of the atmosphere is going to have a big influence, and not just on the west side of the Oregon Cascade. So this is a paper that was published in 2023 looking at stands in Central European forests. And they said in their paper that thinning can increase soil water availability, but it also increases transpiration sensitivity to high temperatures and may amplify tree vulnerability to heat and drought. So I think this is a really new, kind of a new understanding of how trees are interacting with their atmosphere and how they may or may not be susceptible to future changes, both in climate in general and then specifically to the prevalence of drought, and something that is worth exploring further and having a better understanding of how that might work in forests of Oregon. So that was everything I had. Thank you very much for listening.